brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
So we talked last time about the original mythological, the very early mythological figures in Chinese history. And by the way, everybody, we're on episode, I believe, 58, is it? Episode 58, and we are still on mythological early Chinese history. Basically, Neolithic times we're talking about here. What's interesting about the stories, as we talked about last time, is that it's possible that in some of them, within some of them, there's echoes of some cultural memories, not just of one group of people, but a whole tribe of people that once upon a time inhabited the territory that is now known to us as China, as the state of China. The very early fabulous or mythological emperors and heroes were the Fuzi and his wife Nue, who were snake-like characters, and we talked about the statue that they have in China, and this says some of the depictions of these snake-like ruler figures, but they are very mythological. We talked about the Book of Change, and this is the early Chinese signs. That's another depiction of the same system that's now they really only used for fortune telling or for future telling, which unlike in the Western culture, in the Eastern culture is not a marginal thing, but it is very much an everyday thing that a lot of people practice to this day, and it's very, very archaic. We talked about early cultural heroes within this triad, because this is usually known as the Great Triad. The Heavenly Flower, whose name is Sheng Nun, and how he was depicted originally as a minotaur type creature, bull-like, and you can see the vestiges of that right here in the little bumps on his head or his horned hat. Here he is plowing the earth. This is the plow type instrument that they used in China at that time or on territories of modern day China. We talked also a little bit about Cao Zhen, who was a fourth character and who was kind of probably a visitor from other tribes, from other cultures into the Chinese mythology. He's rarely mentioned. Usually it's the first three that I just mentioned. It's the husband and wife that are snake-like and the first flower. But then we also have this rare Prometheus type character who, according to some versions of some early Chinese legends, was the one who brought fire to people and taught them how to not live in the trees and make nests, but how to actually be somewhat civilized. So that's the most archaic cycle of the mythological Chinese history. Now we're going to move to the five great ones. And again, this is very ancient times we're talking about. This is purely mythological history, but this is mythological history that is absolutely innate to the Chinese culture today. It is commonly referenced in their just everyday movies, cartoons, metaphors, and other mentions of these characters take place in even today's like police TV series. Presidents of companies may be mentioning these characters in their inspirational speeches. Little kids know these characters in kindergarten. These are characters that are just as innate to their culture as to us. For example, such characters as King Arthur are, as some Noah, some other kind of very incorporated historical figures. All right, so the very first, very major cultural hero in Chinese self-identity is the Yellow Emperor. I'm sure you guys have all heard of the Yellow Emperor, and I just had a picture of him up on screen. I'm going to show it once again. This is a mythological character, but he is oftentimes considered to be the first emperor of China, though there's no record or accounts of such a person. As far as archaeology can tell, from the Western point of view, we remember that the Western scientists and the Chinese scientists have a very different outlook on Chinese history to the Chinese population in general, and even some of their scientists, such as historians, modern day, and archaeologists. These are not just mythological characters. They believe that these are reflections of some sort of cultural memory. The Western scientists, on the other hand, outright set them aside as nothing more than mythological. So what did this great fellow do? His name is Huan Di. So he is presented very, very realistically in the chronicles. And we remember that the chronicles, some of these mythos have been collected, and most likely during the Shang dynasty, these notes, these stories were cleaned up to make them look less magical, less fantastical, and make them look a lot more like living people, like actual history. Because in Chinese culture, there's kind of a cult of history and knowing history and ancestors. And so it is believed that it was during the Shang dynasty that their chroniclers wanted to turn this into something more than fairy tales and make it more believable. So this character is presented extremely realistically comparing to the previous ones we've talked about. But he still has some fantastical features. First of all, he's believed to have been born as a result of a lightning strike. He's oftentimes described as a giant, an enormous, tall, mighty man with a dragon visage, a dragon aspect about him, though it's often not really clarified what aspect of dragon it is about him. But in some of the older versions of the story, he's plain and simply described as actually being a dragon. And that makes sense if you think about the way he's going to die or the way he's going to move away from our storyline. He existed at a time when tribes started rebelling. And so he decided to gather together an army of leopards and boars, and he armed them with stone and nephrite axes, and he went to the great central city, whatever that city was at the time, and that varies from story to story, and he seized the power for himself. A character named Sheng Nun was ruling at the time, and so he overthrew this fellow, and he overcame a rebellious lord in the later versions of the story, who in the earlier versions of the story is described as a dragon-type monster also. So we actually have a theme here that is not that different from the theme we're going to see in much later in the European stories, though these are not in any way related. When you have a dragon slayer defeating a dragon. Saint George is the Christian version of that same story. And when we much later on start talking about early Germanic and Slavic stories that are called Bellini, or the stories of the past, oftentimes the dragon slayer has dragon feet, or dragon features, which are most of the time are dragon feet. There's something dragon-like about the feet of the character who winds up defeating the dragon. Usually it's kind of atrophied in the European tradition to basically have the character represented as somebody who has something wrong with their feet. Either they have, I don't know, an iron foot, or they have a feet made of gold, or they can't walk, some sort of damage to their feet, to their legs, to their lower extremities. And oftentimes it goes back to that same idea of a snake-tailed cultural hero who's half monster, half human, who slays the full-on monster. So this is something, a parallel that I just drew, actually just looking at my own notes, that in Chinese culture, in the same way you have a character who is dragon-like, defeating potentially a dragon-type rebellious monster. Now, of course, under later rewriting of the same mythological story, the character was turned into a man who is defeating a rebellious lord. But nonetheless, he's doing it with an army of bears and army of leopards. He arms them with stone axes because this is before the Bronze Age. I find it fascinating how some of these early tales, despite the fact that they've been edited, re-edited, re-edited bazillion times, even back in antiquity, the progression of humanity seems to be somehow reflected. First, you have people living up in the trees and making nests, right? And you have a deity that comes down and helps them come down off the trees. Now you have appropriately have this magical army armed with period proper weapons such as stone tools. I don't know, to me that's kind of neat. I'm not sure if that's intentional, just a kind of an accident or coincidence, but I think it's pretty cool.
A lot of legends have some truth in them. They start somewhere, and of course over the years things get added to them, but at the core they may actually relate what actually happened.
Yeah, or at least have some sort of a core, like a spark of the original story in them, absolutely. Though in Chinese case, oftentimes things get subtracted from them, not added. It's weird. Now, this guy is kind of the old hero. He is the man who, according to fairy tales, according to the legends, had invented clothing and shoes. He invented spears, axes, and war drums to be able to coordinate his troops. He also introduced things like wells. He introduced things like boats and carts, and a lot of other cultural innovations that took place to make the peoples more civilized than they were prior to his coming. So in that sense, he's extremely, extremely central to Chinese self-identity. Also, the oldest known Chinese actual existing medicinal treatise or text on how to use medicinal plants is attributed, some parts of it are attributed to this character, and that's the Yellow Emperor. Now, that's highly unlikely according to modern researchers, but in Chinese narrative in general, when they want to prove that something is very valid, because, and at the same time, very ancient, they oftentimes will ascribe the authorship or part of the authorship to Huangdi as the first, the kind of the picture perfect ruler. He had a very talented court. He had a lot of different people around him who were, well, people will talk about their peopleness here in a minute, but he had a lot of individuals around him. He was able to select his staff in a very creative and very proper manner. His wife, for example, Lea Zhu, she's believed or legendarily assigned to be the one who invented silk, who was first to implement silk. He had another minister among many other ministers in his court, a four-eyed minister, who is believed to have invented hieroglyphic writing system. And he had four eyes on him, you know, very normal, very realistic individuals, right? Now, I mentioned when I was talking about earlier about how this would fit with his passing. The story goes that at the end of his reign, when he was no longer a valid ruler of the realm, a sacred dragon came down and carried him off on its wings up into the heavens. Now, the heavens in Chinese worldview are not the same as the Christian heavens. I want to clarify that very much for everyone who may not be so familiar with the Asian kind of mythos. It's the idea of the sky being the kind of the great pure place where people go after life if they're very perfect. Is similar in both Christian, Judeo-Christian, and Asian, and a lot of other mythologies, actually. And then there was the idea that he is the one who gave the names to the Chinese people. So when Chinese people want to talk about themselves as, say all of us, all of us people of China, but say it in a kind of a more poetic and more inspired way, they say that we're all grandchildren of Huangdi. It's a paraphrase for people, all the people today who live in China. So this is a very identity-forming character for the Chinese peoples today. His mausoleum is purported to exist, and here's an interesting thing about his mausoleum. His mausoleum survived from, or his supposed mausoleum, which never has been excavated, but there's still being, people still visit it and still offer their respects. It existed from that time long ago, immemorable kind of ancient time, all the way through Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, all the way through the communist rule that we have today, untouched, unharmed. It still exists today, and when given a chance, the Chinese government nominated it to be #1 cultural treasure with UNESCO. Even though it does not have a lot of archaeological value, there's a lot of other sites in China that are much more factually, they have a lot more artifacts, they have a lot more finds there, but this is so central to Chinese self-identity that this is their #1 UNESCO cultural site. It is their central cultural hero. It is their central icon of the country.
Well, I was just thinking that the Chinese tend to be not a monoculture, well, they're monoculture, but they have a central figure who can be the unifier for this. That makes sense, even if it was real or not real. I mean, having that as a figure, as a symbol for the culture and the people, that would work.
No, and that makes sense. I just wanna clarify that I did not say what you just said. I just want to kind of space myself. I'm not saying necessarily they don't have a self-identity. I was saying it more in the sense of like the French can say we're the children of freedom, or Americans can say we're the children of. It's
just a central figure that gives rise to your existence and gives credibility to what you are. You can point to that character,
right?
As being a fundamental part of what you are.
And they believe that they, in a spiritual way, they're all his children. They're all his descendants, and that unifies all. Because you are right, China is not a uniform population in the sense that it's believed that a lot of these stories are a conglomeration of mythos from multiple groups that lived on that territory back in the old times, and then different time periods and cultures that overlapped, and all of that got kind of compounded together and compressed into one narrative, which is just like Bible, for example, is not very smooth, even though both have been edited for centuries. Okay, so the next character is Xiao Hao, and this is indeed a strange character. How he got into the lineup of cultural heroes of China is very strange. Some people believe that most likely he was actually a negative deity, kind of a scary, evil god, not evil, but dark god of one of nearby tribes that somehow got integrated into this lineup. He has nothing to do, is not related in any way with all the other characters that we're going to talked about. So this character is very often described as being bird-like or having bird-like features. His court is entirely, all his ministers and everybody in his court has bird names, or most likely were birds, most likely vulture type birds. There's some indication. And he is in mythology, Chinese mythology, he's actually in one way or another has family blood relations with all the chthonic, all the dark, all the base monsters, creatures of Chinese mythology, creatures that are not much different than Tiamat, for example. And of course, Tiamat is not a Chinese character. I'm just using her as an example. But that's the kind of relatives this character has. So how he wound up being, number 2 on the Chinese ruler lineup, we don't know. So he may have been a bad god, and that's all we're really going to say about him. We're going to move on to other relatives of our yellow emperor. Zhuanxu was the next one who came to rule, and he was the grandson of our yellow emperor. And he was the ruler during whose rule all the ways, all the connecting pathways between the earth and the heavens got disrupted and destroyed. And it's kind of funny how that went down. So according to the story, some Chinese, at that time proto-Chinese housewife, who was busy making wontons, had her hands covered on all this sticky, gooey kitchen stuff because she was just making this food. And she decided to go into heavens or reach into heavens with her dirty, messy housewife hands. And that made everybody so displeased that all the communications got cut off and people's lost the ability to travel between the earth and the heavens. So blame the women for everything, whether it's Eve with her apple, and it's always food, whether it's Eve with her apple or it's some unnamed Chinese housewife with her basically hands covered with flour. But that's about all that is known about this character. Now, Gaoxi is again next character that goes into this list or lineup of rulers of the Great Five. Gaoxi most likely was a state cult that most likely existed or was somehow related to, again, the Shang dynasty, because the Shang dynasty had a tradition of naming, because in Asian cultures, when we talk about Thailand and so forth, we'll talk about this whole thing with names and renaming and naming and naming and never telling anybody your real name, even today. But they would rename their ministers, their important bureaucrats after their death, and even their rulers, they would give them a posthumous name. And so they had a tradition of naming their wands, so their ruling, their administrative kind of supervisors, after various members of the court of this character of the Gaoxi. And that's all we know about him. And also we know something about the fact that he may have been plowing somewhere in the vicinity of the Shang capital using an elephant. That's pretty much really all the information we have about this guy. Of course, there's much more than that. That's all we need to know. His son, Diji, was not a very good ruler. So he got overthrown and that dynasty went away. And instead of that unsuccessful, foolish ruler, a younger brother of Gaoxi came to the throne, and he is known as Yao, or sometimes he is known as Khan. And this is a very important character. I'm going to show you some pictures of him. Well, not pictures of him. I would, but wouldn't that be lovely if we had pictures of all these guys, right? Here's this picture or image of Yao or Khan. I'm just going to call him Yao to not confuse the matters further. So that's what he's most commonly known as. He is considered to be the first perfect and ideal ruler. Now, let's talk about what the Chinese concept of an ideal ruler is. He is used as an example to all the future rulers. For example, later on in Chinese court, if a bureaucrat wanted to approach the emperor and suggest that, because in Chinese court culture, you could not come to the ruling entity and say, hey, your majesty or your highness or your imperial great enormousness, right? You couldn't come to them like you could in Western culture and say, hey, I think you're not doing a very good job here. This is messed up. Let's redo this differently. No, what the bureaucrats and the courtiers would have to do is ask the emperor for permission to tell them a tale from the history, important historical chronicles of China. And then they would say, back in the time of Yao, once upon a time there had lived a man, and he came to the ruler with such and such question, or this and this happened, and this is what Yao did. And that's as far as they could go in giving advice to their rulers and their supervisors. This guy is number one advice giving. He's the good sister you're constantly getting compared to, right? He was very modest in his spendings. He only wore the clothing, common folks' clothing. He allowed common folks to hunt in his forest and use his other resources he shared with the people. He was a king of the people, according to the stories. He was very modest, very non-demanding, not very lavish. But that's not what was important about him. The most important thing, what made him a perfect perfect ruler of China at that time in the stories is that he was completely idle, as in he did nothing. He interfered in nothing. He plowed his field nearby his whatever his city was. He did family stuff, and he did nothing. He did not introduce taxes. He did not lead armies. He did not get involved in any bureaucratic processes. He did not hire foreign ministers. He did nothing. That is the perfect ruler under the Chinese mental state. Why? Because the ruler has only one purpose, and he is a conduit between the heavens and the earth. He does not need to do a darn thing. He needs to sit there and conduct. Through him, something akin to mana, we use the term mana today when we play video games or card games or talk about Dungeons and Dragons, but mana is like energy, a blissful, life-giving, life-reinforcing energy that flows from the heavens, only can go through this one character of the ruler, through this one narrow passage. Because as we remember in earlier rule, all the direct lines between the earth and the heavens have been destroyed by a silly housewife. And so the moment he starts messing with worldly stuff, issuing orders about how his court should be handled, being worried about lavish outfits, or rivers would flow on time and in a non-dangerous manner, because as we know in China there was a lot of flooding, flowers would bloom, weird barbarian tribes from the fringes of their civilized reality would not come and attack. And as long as the ruler was good, as long as the ruler had no vices, this perfect channel, this flow of energy would continue to be bestowed upon the land. And this, in a way, was daily confirmed to the people who lived in that region at that time, because they were completely separated from any other civilized peoples for quite a long time. Their first introduction to other civilizations was circa 2000 AD. So 2nd century BC is the first time the Chinese peoples contacted other civilized people. Up until this point, they had lived in a world that they thought that they were the only civilized society at all, and around them existed nothing but the dark, dangerous, wild, barbarian world. And what does that sound a lot like to you guys? This ruler who is, without him, the rivers won't flow, the rain won't fall. As long as the ruler was good, the plagues would not attack. What does that sound a lot like to you guys? Almost contemporary culture, the Egyptian pharaoh. And if you guys are fans of Terry Pratchett's books, when the one about the pharaoh, when the Nile won't, well, it's not the Nile and Terry Pratchett, but basically the Nile will not flood and fertilize the valley unless there's a pharaoh to do this, to be there to perform the duty of making the world turn, basically. That's what an emperor, that's what a good ruler in China is supposed to do. This is an ideal ruler. You sit at home, you do nothing, you plow your little field, wife makes you clothing, you only wear that, you don't interfere with common folks, you don't interfere with the bureaucrats. And bureaucrats really like that idea, right? Because as long as the ruler is not interfering, the same thing in Europe. If the king goes mad or the king is an infant, nobility gets to play. Well, in this case, it's not nobility, it's bureaucrats. Their rule is the source of heavenly blessing and of prosperity. Some important things happened. A lot of things happened during the rule of this mythological character. A lot of their traditional, very kind of story originating mythological characters existed, but I'm going to talk about just one who is very popular. Hero is named Hao Yi, or the shooter or the archer Yi. And this character is famous for having averted a horrible disaster. Once upon a time, 9 suns came out onto the sky. Instead of 1 sun, we had 9 suns. And he was the archer who was able to shoot down the extra suns and rescue the world from catastrophe that way. And then, again, another parallel, I'm sure pretty obvious one here. This very Gilgamesh-like character decided that he wished to seek immortality. And like Gilgamesh, he went on an enormous lengthy journey, and he acquired 2 portions of this immortality potion, this immortality tincture, one for himself and one for his wife. And when he got home, there's 2 versions to the story here. Version number 1, his wife wanted to be a goddess. So she took both portions, both doses of this immortality potion. First one made her immortal, second one made her goddess, after which, knowing that her husband would not be very pleased, she ran off to heavens and became the goddess of the moon. She inhabits the moon now. The other version is the great hero himself by this point in time was like Gilgamesh in his young days, was getting pretty mighty and pretty unbearable. And he was looking to become a tyrant and a horror for all the people around. And so his good and pious wife, in her desire to rescue the people from this evil fate, and so he would not live forever, took both portions Either way, she became the goddess of the moon. And to this day, a very important celebration takes place in China regularly, mid-fall, and to celebrate the goddess of the moon. And they celebrate each other. They cook very unappetizing for us cookies type dough things, exchange with each other.
Mooncakes, they call them.
Right. So that's the origin of that story. The next biggest cultural hero after the Yellow Emperor, right? But not all was well in the land of King Yao. Weather started becoming not his friend. Now, we have talked a little bit about the idea of the heavenly mandate. Have we talked about the mandate of the heavens or the mandate of the sky in the Mongol culture a little bit? Was it just in my head because I think about it all the time? Okay, this is an interesting concept. So in a lot of Asian cultures, well, heck, in all of the world cultures, let me go backwards. In all of the world cultures, traditionally, back in the day when we had the whole idea of a priest king or god king, whether it's Pharaoh or it's, in Egypt, Mesopotamia, when they still had the idea of a godlike king, when the king in a way is representative of the fertility. It goes really closely to fertility rites, to where the king is a representative of the male sky fertilization part of the process, and the land or the earth is representative of the female birth-giving essence. And the ruler is meant to literally, in some cases, mate with the earth. In some faraway Siberian Russian villages, as recently as in early 20th century, this was still a part of regular plowing down. They had no kings at that point in time, but the serfs oftentimes would plow with their pants off, for example. Their first time, they would first stroke of the plow they would put down on earth. By the way, this is where our paraphrase "to plow her," in a sexual context, comes from. It's a very ancient reference to those very early kind of fertilization rites. Bottom line is, in all world's cultures, there was the idea that the ruler their function is not to rule. Their function, as we described before, their function is to represent the fertility force. And oftentimes when that icon or that avatar of male fertility of the heavens would lose their fertility, that would manifest itself, for example, by poor crops, by some sort of a cattle illness or people's illness, lack of, if animals weren't breeding, if anything, the droughts, floods, any of that stuff indicated that the earth is not happy with her husband, and then the king would go and a new one would be elected. In China, it was a little bit more, because we have much more distant stories of this, right? We don't have it firsthand. We kind of have reworked versions of the story, but a similar thing happened. And I want you to think, as we talk about throughout this whole series of podcasts, as we talk about the idea of this mandate of the sky, how many revolutions, how many uprisings, how many coups to this day in the world are affected by this very subconscious, very subliminal, not even realized, whether in the West or in the East, belief by the people that the ruler is responsible for any disasters that befall the land, whether it's rational or not. And how often, disaster, disease, droughts, just financial unrest, any sort of economical hardship leads for the people to turn around and attack the ruler, even if they know for a fact that that ruler is in no way to blame for that particular deed.
That just happened in England. But the prime minister resigned after 45 days because the world was going bad. So everybody was a gangster, even though she was trying to help, but it didn't matter. Exactly the same.
Right. Exactly. And well, in that case, maybe, I'm not great expert on British politics or economics, but potentially in this case, the actor was responsible for the actions, right? But in case, for example, when you just have a drought, you just have a darn drought. You can try to do all you want to, right? As a ruler, you can hand out your storages of grains or rice or whatever it may be to the folks, but drought continues. Or if it's an epidemic attack, right? If they're especially in early times, the people, it's not rational. That the ruler is not in any way responsible for this, but no, they are responsible for this. Now, the early Chinese took it to a whole new level. They had a whole map laid out of what natural disaster meant what wise in their ruler. So, for example, if they had droughts, that meant, I'm just making it up, that their emperor was too greedy. If they had floods, it meant their emperor was too lusty. If they had hail, it meant that their emperor was too late. You could look outside at the weather and tell exactly what's going on with the emperor at any point in time. Why is this important? Well, for our main character here, for Yao, towards the end of his rule, flooding started happening. Disastrous flooding. People were not quite starving, but good land was being covered by water. Hungry beasts, hunger was looming. Hungry beasts started invading populated human settlements. So he sent one of his ministers, a very mighty engineer, who proposed the idea of creating dams to overcome this hardship. And this minister's name was Gun. He was a very mighty minister, or in some cases, he was a four-eyed fish monster. Nonetheless, this minister tried to combat this. The king was handing out his stores of food to the peoples, but that was not good enough. The peoples understood, look, this ruler, he has lost the mandate of the heaven. He is no longer the approved ruler. We need to replace him. Being a smart man, he decided that he was going to kind of step down before he got stepped down, right? And he first tried to pass the rules, the rule to his son. Now, his son turned out not to be very smart. He was kind of slow, not very clever, kind of not very intellectually dexterous. And so part of the legend is that in an attempt to develop his son's thinking, strategic, capacity, and just in general, his intelligence, the Chinese version of chess was invented for that purpose. But instead of helping this kid become a better, more capable person, the kid just got completely obsessed with it, like kids do today with video games, and completely lost interest in anything in the world. Bottom line is, the heir to the throne was no good at all. So the king started looking for somebody good. And then he found another great character who was to take his place. And he stepped down. Now, here enters a character who is so very different from the Yao character we're describing here, right? So here's our depiction of Yao, and here's his successor, who's supposedly not related to him in any way. Do you see much of a difference? Neither do I. Nonetheless, they're kind of a pair, and they oftentimes depicted very similar to each other, almost identical. It's, for us, the Westerners, with our uneducated ways and subtleties of Chinese culture, they look very similar. They're portrayed very similarly. It's because they're both ideal rulers, one after another. Here enters the next greatest Chinese cultural hero after the Yellow Emperor, and his name is Shun. Shun was recommended to the king as his successor because Shun was a darn saint with a halo floating, well, I'm joking, of course, but with a halo floating around his head and little, ghostly angel wings. So if we are looking at it through a Christian prism, kind of fluttering behind his back. Shun had a really shady family. His father was blind and nasty. His mother was mean, nasty, ugly. His brothers and other siblings were just disgusting, greedy. They were dirt poor. They were envious. They were nasty, disgusting, unpleasant peoples, but they were his family. And so we have story after story about Shun, how his family is plotting to murder him. They constantly trying to kill him. They tried to kill him this way. They tried to kill him that way. For example, one of the stories, they got him drunk. They threw him down a well. Then they dumped soil on top of the well. Then they jumped on top of the soil and they went, aha, they killed him. Well, why did they hate him so much? Why did they want to kill him? Well, because he was a nice guy. He was a genuinely good, righteous, pious, and nice guy. And he somehow always managed to outsmart them. But that's not what made him so distasteful to his multiple kindred. What made his family hate him is not only did he manage to escape their attempts to murder him, he managed to do it in a way when he did not say a single accusatory word. He did not give a single accusatory look to anybody who was related to him. He always valued his family. He always treated his parents with uttermost respect, his elders and his relatives. And he never made them feel guilty in any, or even hint that they were in any way responsible for his mishaps, even though he knew for a fact that they were the ones, in fact, trying to murder him. That is the ideal of a Chinese saint, okay? This is an idea that is very different to our Western culture. So this fellow finally got sick of his family and he decided to move away. He built a house in the middle of nowhere, right? Well, next thing that happened, people started flocking to where he lived and people started building houses around his house, and eventually a city or a town formed around where this man lived. And again, that was a sign of heavenly mandate, or the sky mandate upon this person. That's how the previous ruler knew that this is the guy that is approved by the sky to be my successor. And so he called him to court, and then he did another really hard test. He made this poor fellow go through a horrible hardship. He said, man, you're going to be my successor, so you must marry my daughters. You must marry the princesses. Oh boy, said Shun. And he married these princesses, and it was such a tribulation. It was such a horrible, horrible trial. Apparently, there were no present. There were no little gift. There were no sweet prize. It took him several years to finally whip them. Well, that doesn't say that per se, but we're going to suppose that since he had to train them to become the perfect wives. So, in Western legends, the princess is always the prize, and that's where the story ends. In Chinese legends, if the peoples in power really hate you, they'll make you marry a princess, and that will be your curse. So I'm going to stop and see if anybody has anything to say, and I'm going to just really quickly finish up with him, and we're done with this part of the story, if you don't mind going over just a couple of minutes.
There's so very, very common with the locals that live here in Wyoming. Our ideal legislator and governing body is the less that someone does, the better they are. And the ideal governor and the ideal legislator is the person who does the least of all. So there's a contemporary parallel.
Right. And Nathan, Ryan, how you asked me last time, what was it that I was having such difficulty wrapping my head around? I'm just going to say it out loud right now instead of writing. I was going to write it down for the end, but I'll just say it out now. What I had such a hard time was accepting, kind of innately understanding the Chinese and this, the Asian worldview. That's the difference, the key difference, I think, between Asia, and the West, between East and West, is that in those traditional cultures, inactivity, lack of activity is what's valued. To where in the Western world, it's the active, that's the action, it's the proactive. So being able to sit on the river bank and watch your enemies' bodies float by versus leading an army and fighting them, that's the difference. That's the key difference that really separates the mentality for me, and that makes some of these ideals a little bit interesting for us to try to comprehend, to try to place ourselves into the shoes of these people.
Okay, I think I understand what you're trying to say, and that actually is an interesting it's an interesting thing to think about. That for some reason that reminds me of the film with Bruce Lee, his big famous one, Enter the Dragon, when he says, "Oh, my style, the art of fighting without fighting." It's like, oh yeah, that's kind of an interesting way to think about things.
So it's passivity versus activity, yeah.
The Chinese have a saying, a chabu doi, which basically means good enough. Like they just do the minimum. Like in Japan, they have people that specialize in something and devote their lives to a simple thing and get it perfect. But the Chinese go, yeah, that's good enough. And that's our version of the word is good enough. But for them, it's just, you do the minimum that you need to do to get by.
Right. And that makes sense because just the nature of the civilization, particularly the Chinese, what became China later, was very different. It will be interesting to talk about this as we go through the Chinese cycle. As we talk about Chinese history and Chinese development in general, like what environmental factors, what cultural factors shaped that mentality versus in the West where proactive. The Greek idea of a hero, God who's always going somewhere. Even today's action, we have the word action heroes, right? In China, it would be inaction heroes. They created a similar parallel cultural phenomenon. So
That'd be a good name for a comic book.
Right. Actually, that would be. I bet you there's already one. So this man was a saint. This was a saint on the throne, and he is in a lot of ways comparable. And when he started his rule, he was almost identical to Yao, in the sense that he did the same thing. He didn't interfere, blah, blah, blah. The only thing that he did interfere in is that the flooding still continued, and this was no good. So this very kind I'm going to tell you one more good thing about this particular ruler. So some of very old ancient Chinese musical melodies go back to a pet this fellow had, to a pet Shun had when he became the king. He had a pet crocodile who liked to lay on his back and drum himself on his chest with his tail and his feet and make music that way. And so in that sense, some invention of some forms of music is assigned, of joyful music is assigned to this character. So he was very adorable. But flooding continues, dams aren't helping. And so he summons his previous ruler's minister who was supposed to fix this problem. The minister, as we remember, was a four-eyed fish. And he executes him. He says, your solution has failed us horribly, away with you. He kills him, and he assigns, and this is common in Chinese practice, he assigns this fellow's son to be the next one in charge. Now, as we remember, the minister before was a fish, a multi-eyed fish monster, also a great minister. His son is not a fish. That's a good thing. He's actually oftentimes described again as a, salt of the earth, kind of one of the folks. He's just a modest plowing man. But again, you see that same plowing instrument, the two-pronged plowing device. But he was just a good-natured fellow, hardworking, simple. He dug, he came up with a different solution than his father. His father's solution was to build dams. This guy said, no, we are going to dig channels. And so he went about, simple American fellow, Joe Schmo, by changing into a giant mole and digging rivers, building mountains. And on the mythological level, all of the modern geography of China, all the rivers, channels, big and small, legendarily go back to this fellow. He was the one who, in the shape of the giant mole, dug around left and right, and built mountains and hills and created the China as we know it today geographically. But he solved the problem. He was able to dig these channels, and he was able to get the water to drain. He solved the problem with the floods. And of course, it was natural that he would be the next reasonable successor in this line of rulers. But he is not one of the great five. He is the next great character that we know as the great Yui, who is also associated with the creation of legendary dynasty of Xia. Xia is believed to be historical absolutely by anybody who is Chinese, whether they are a scholar or they are a lay person. They actually have exact dates. Originally, the Chinese scientists came up with actual dates when this dynasty has actually, they believe, existed. And that's, again, 2005 to 2067 BC. But Western archaeologists adamantly deny the existence of this dynasty. In the lineup of dynastic successions of China, in every Chinese person's mind, this is a very real existing dynasty. There's been no archaeological evidence found to support its existence, but as any, even the most established, most pro-Western Chinese archaeologist or historian will tell you, just because we have found no evidence to prove that it did exist does not mean that it didn't exist, right? And that's a valid argument. And I actually brought something that I have as to finish my story real quick, just to make us feel a little bit more China-minded. This is something my dad brought back to me from China when he traveled there, and that's one of the famous replica of one of the famous tripods, ceremonial vessels. Yeah, these are iconic of China. You see, it has 3 legs, it has a little handle. These were, of course, enormous. This is a small replica, but yeah. And that's pretty much everything I wanted to get through today. Does anybody have any thoughts, comments, complaints, or ideas?
Question, actually. What are we going to do for the next podcast?
We can continue with the Xia dynasty because I want to get through this mythological lineup all the way to the actual first emperor of China, to the beginning of the Han dynasty. And then we can move on and jump on to something else, whatever it is you guys want to do after this.
Yeah, what I'm finding really interesting, how, and especially part of perhaps the discussion moving forward, is how this history, how this combination of history and mythology shapes the Chinese worldview, especially into a conversation that helps us better understand.
Yeah, and I think we all will be learning as we go along. Thank you, everyone, for your support in this project. Thank you for your support on the personal level. Your support, your involvement, your kind words mean a lot to me. This has been an awesome project. I cannot believe how far we've gotten into this. I mean, we've covered so much stuff that nobody else covers. And I think that's pretty darn awesome. And we actually have viewers from all over the world commenting, thanking us for these podcasts. People from the Middle East, people from Caucasus, people from China, people from Latin America, all over the world, Europe. I do have one more request for you guys. Facebook does not like me, and I don't like Facebook. It's giving me issues sharing this in appropriate groups. If you have the inkling, and if you happen to have a Facebook account, and if you happen to be a member of any of their, history-related groups, don't share more than one share a day, because that will make you not able to share anything at all. I did 5 and they banned, even though they were topic appropriate, they banned me from sharing at all at the moment. If you feel like just posting the link somewhere here and there, that would be so darn helpful, because I think we do some great work, and I think we deserve to get out this material to the audience that is interested in it. We've been getting awesome comments. I have not had to ban anybody with negative comments, not once so far, not one person, and that's pretty amazing. And anybody who's watching this episode, if you like what we're doing, like us, share us with your friends. That helps a lot. Comment, engage in discussion. I will get back to you as soon as I'm physically able to. And we really appreciate all of our viewers, and I really appreciate all of you guys who participate in this a lot.
That exist within every man's soul.